Hello, I'm Larry Wilson, and welcome to the July 2005 broadcast. Today we begin our study on Revelation 4. Actually, chapters 4 through 6 tell an incredible story, and grasping the significance of this story will take some time and effort. You already know that Bible study takes effort. And you should know that every effort you put forth to know and understand God will be rewarded. Hebrews 11:6 says, "Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him." And then in Revelation 1:3, you remember there's a blessing promised for everyone who reads the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near. Revelation 4 through 6 has puzzled Christians ever since the book of Revelation was written. And I must confess, it puzzled me for many years. Many Christians tend to diminish the importance of chapters 4 and 5, and then they get all excited about chapter 6, which contains 6 of the 7 seals. The problem with this approach is that the intended meaning of this prophecy cannot be reached. I have a profound statement coming. I'm going to put it on the computer screen for you to look at, because I have so few profound statements to make. Here it is. We cannot properly understand the 7 seals without first understanding the role and importance of the book that was sealed with the 7 seals. In other words, you have to understand the whole thing before you can understand anything. You've got to understand the role and importance of the book before the 7 seals are going to make much sense. The story of the 7 seals centers around the book that was written by the Father and sealed up with 7 seals so that no one could see what He has written. What would you think of a person who gets excited about the wrapping on a gift and ignores the contents of the box that holds the gift? Well, you would say that would be very foolish. Well, the parallel is identical. We've got to understand the all-important significance of this book if we're going to appreciate what the 7 seals actually are. And that's my prayer and my hope for this seminar segment, that I can begin to introduce to you what this book is all about and how that it is God's way. God chose to solve one of His biggest problems by writing a book. And at the end of the 1,000 years, the Bible tells us in Revelation 20, this book will be opened up and God will show everyone 3 things. He's going to prove 3 things to everybody in the universe. You see, at the end of the 1,000 years, the saints will all be alive, the wicked will all be alive, and Lucifer and his angels will all be present, and all the angels of the universe will be gathered to see what was written in this book. God's going to demonstrate 3 things when He opens this book up. First, that He has perfect foreknowledge. He knows everything from end to beginning. And we can trust that He has perfect foreknowledge. The second thing God is going to prove is that He does not use His perfect foreknowledge to influence or manipulate His subjects. In other words, God can be trusted with this incredible gift of omniscience, all-knowing, not to use it in any way that would be harmful or manipulative of his subjects. And the third thing that God is going to prove is that even though he foreknew the rise, the agony, and the price of sin, he did nothing to prevent it. Because, you see, as a God of love, he freely grants his children the power of choice. In other words, this little book, sealed up with 7 seals, will prove to the universe once and for all that God does not predestine anyone to be saved or destroyed. This is a crucial point. When God opens this book up and he shows what he knew from the beginning, before the world was created, this book will prove to the universe that he does not predestine anyone to be saved or destroyed. Let's go back to the computer screen. You see, the choice of salvation or rebellion is ours to make. We can choose to be rebellious against God, or we can choose to be submissive to his will. We are creatures having the power of choice. And the presence of sin in the universe proves that God will allow angels and human beings to rebel against his law. It's all about choice. Because we have the power of choice, we are responsible for our actions. Think about that for a moment. Because we have been given the power of choice, we are responsible for our actions. And that's why God judges us according to our deeds. He knows our faith by examining our deeds. Okay, let's begin with Revelation chapter 4, verse 1. I've inserted some of my comments in the text as we go along, so you will notice the little parenthetical comments as we proceed. John begins, "After this," that is, after receiving the 7 messages for the 7 churches, he says, "I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet," this is the voice of Jesus, which he had heard in Revelation 1:10. The voice said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place afterwards, or hereafter, or after this." The Greek word meta is translated hereafter in the King James Version. In the NIV, it's translated after this. The idea is later on. I'm going to show you what must take place later on. In Revelation 4:2, John says, "At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven, and someone sitting on it." In the twinkling of an eye, John was in the Spirit. Now, you must recall that John has been in the Spirit ever since he began receiving this vision. In Revelation 1:10, John writes, "On the Lord's day," and I've explained to you already how that this was the Sabbath day, John says, "I was in the Spirit." In the Spirit. "And I heard behind me a loud voice, like a trumpet, which said, 'Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches.'" Okay, John begins and enters into a vision from chapter 1. He's in the Spirit. And the Apostle Paul also had an in the Spirit experience. Paul contrasts being in the Spirit as being out of the body. Let me go through 2 Corinthians 12 briefly here and explain something about Paul's comments and what we can understand about John's experience as well. The church at Corinth had a problem. There was a lot of boasting going on by the Jewish converts, claiming that because they were descendants of Abraham, that they were closer to God and more important to God than the Gentile converts. And of course, this really frosted Paul, and he's writing to correct this boasting and this foolish arrogance. And Paul goes on in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 1, talking about the fact that he's a Hebrew of the Hebrews, that there's no Jew that has been more zealous for the cause of God than himself. And then he says in verse 1, I must go on boasting. He's trying to show how foolish boasting is. He says, although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. So now Paul is going to show that if anyone has a right to boast, it is he. But he's going to show that his boasting it's all meaningless, it's all fruitless. But he's appealing to the fact that he has a reason to boast that none of them have, because he has been given visions and revelations from the Lord. So in verse 2, he starts off by talking about his experience in the third person. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. In ancient times, there were three heavens. There was the heavens of the birds, there was the heaven of the stars, and then there was the heaven where God lived. And so he says, I was caught up to the third heaven. Now, watch what he does here. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. I cannot explain this. Only God knows the answer to this, he says. And I know, he goes on in verse 3, that this man, whether he was in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows how he did this. I know that this man was caught up to paradise. That's where God dwells. He heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. So, Paul is describing an experience of being taken up to heaven, to paradise, and he heard things that are just too marvelous, too far beyond human ability. We can't tell them. He can't share them. He said in verse 5 now, I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. Now, he's talking about himself being in the Spirit and in paradise, and he says, I can boast about that, but I'm not going to boast about my mortal flesh except about my weaknesses. Verse 6, even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. Now, verse 7. To keep me from becoming conceited or arrogant, because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh. So Paul is talking about himself, and he's showing how that the Lord, to keep him from becoming puffed up and conceited and boasting about this experience of being taken up to heaven and seeing things, he says, because of these surpassingly great revelations, God has chosen to keep me humble through a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. What he's talking about is probably the loss of his eyesight. Paul lost much of his eyesight when he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. And he was blinded, you may recall, for 3 days, and then his sight was restored, but I don't believe it was completely restored. And you'll find, I believe, at the end of the book of Galatians, he talks about how big the letters are in his writing, because he can't see. So he has to write very large letters when he does write. The point here is that Paul and John were given visions, and while in vision, they could not tell if they were in their body or not. Now listen carefully. However, they were fully cognizant of the experience after it was over. The reality of it, the conversations, the revelation of information otherwise unknown, and the surroundings, which were unlike anything they had ever seen, were as real as yesterday's memory. In other words, this phrase, being in the Spirit, is contrasted to being in the body. Paul couldn't figure out whether he was in the body or out of the body. All he knows is that he was there, and it was real. And the conversations and the revelations that he received and the surroundings were as real as yesterday. This is not like a dream that has goofy and crazy arrangements of information, random information. This is a reality that surpasses even our best experience on the best day of our life, entering into heaven. John there saw the throne of God, and the one who sat there, he said, had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. Jasper is an opaque gem that is usually red or reddish in color, but it can be pink, yellow, green, brown, and grayish blue, depending on the impurities that may be in it. When other minerals are embedded in jasper, jasper shows bands and patterns that are very pretty. Carnelian is an opaque gem also that comes in coral, orange, and reddish colors. And a rainbow resembling an emerald, John says, encircled the throne. Emeralds are generally translucent. That means you can see through them. And they are green to bluish green in color. The interesting thing about this red and blue and green colors that John is reporting is that when added together, these colors produce the three primary colors from which all colors are reproduced, namely red, green, and blue. Just interesting that the throne of God is just shrouded in brilliant glory, light producing all these various colors. I think that's truly beautiful, would be truly beautiful thing, awesome thing to behold. Surrounding the throne, reading now verse 4, there were 24 other thrones. So there's a total of 25 thrones here. And seated on these 24 thrones were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. These crowns are crowns, in the Greek the word is stephanos, which means crowns of victory. These are crowns not of diadema, authority, but crowns of victory. The 24 elders are people who once lived on earth. God took 2 witnesses from each of the 12 tribes to heaven. These people have been elevated to the position of priest, and they were resurrected or translated and taken to heaven to attend this service. In fact, they have been given front row seats around God's throne because they will serve as a jury of human witnesses from earth. A very important meeting is about to take place. And these thrones have been arranged, one throne in the center and 24 thrones surrounding, and 24 human beings have been brought front and center and given a front row seat because they will be a jury, 2 from each of the 12 tribes, a jury of human witnesses that will later report to all the saints about this meeting that is about to take place. Verse 5. From the throne, John says, came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. These phenomena will be studied later on. You may recall, if you've already read Revelation 8:5 and 11, verse 19, and Revelation 16, verse 16 through 18, you know about the flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. These things are phenomena that accompany important events when God does things. And before the throne, John says, 7 lamps were blazing. Then he goes on to say, now these aren't the lampstands. These aren't the 7 lampstands that he saw Jesus walking among. Rather, he says, these are the 7 spirits, that is, the 7 angels that stand before God. He identifies these 7 lamps. These angels are so bright, so brilliant. John just calls them 7 lamps. But he knows that they're not lampstands. These are living creatures, living angels, 7 spirits of God. Going back to Revelation 1:4, let's read that verse and notice what John says. This will help clarify this. John, to the 7 churches in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you from him who is and who was and who is to come, from the Eternal One, from the Father, and from the 7 spirits before his throne. We know in the book of Hebrews that the angels are called ministering spirits. These are the 7 spirits that John sees standing before the throne of God in Revelation 4, verse 5. In verse 6, also before the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass. A sea of glass. A huge expanse, clear as crystal. Like a large pane of glass, clear as crystal. Now, let's jump over to Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 22 and 26. Ezekiel saw this same expanse, this sea of glass. But notice how he describes it. Spread out above the heads of the 4 living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. And above the expanse, over their heads, was what looked like a throne of sapphire. Here he gives the throne a translucent bluish color, something like an emerald color. And high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. So Ezekiel saw this great sea of glass. It's a huge platform upon which the throne of God rests. It sparkles like ice and it looks like glass, according to John. John goes on in verse 6. In the center, around the throne, were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and back. Now, what would eyes suggest to you? The covering of eyes indicate the 4 living creatures are all-seeing. That's the whole idea of the eyes. Covered with eyes, front and back. They see before them, they see behind them, they are all-seeing. That's the representation. These 4 living creatures see everything taking place throughout the universe. And then in verse 7, John goes on to say, and he's talking about the faces of these living creatures. The face of the first living creature was like a lion. The second face was like an ox. The third had the face like a man. And the fourth had a face like a flying eagle. And each of the four living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all around, even under his wings. 6 wings. Day and night, they never stop saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come, who was present through ages past, is present at this moment, and is to come throughout all eternity." The 4 living creatures never stop saying, "Holy, holy, holy." Now Ezekiel also saw these 4 living creatures, and we have just about a minute left, but let's notice what he saw. Ezekiel 1:4. Ezekiel writes, "I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning, and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings." Now, Ezekiel sees 4 wings, John sees 6 wings. Perhaps it has to do with the angle from where they're standing. But their faces look like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox, and also each had the face of an eagle. There you have the same 4 faces that John saw. They had wings. Ezekiel says 4, John says 6, but their form is that of a man, covered with eyes. And when Ezekiel says each of them went straight ahead, wherever the Spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. Well, you can see without much difficulty that John and Ezekiel were shown the same 4 living creatures. And one prophet adds some details that the other prophet didn't see. And so by putting all the pieces together, we begin to see that these 4 living creatures, full of eyes, covered front and back and under their wings, having these wings indicating great speed, and 4 identical living creatures. What does this represent? Well, I'm going to tell you in our next segment. We're out of time right now, but we will resume shortly.